Hey everybody, this is Tim Chavez from Faith Matters. We're super excited about today's episode. We're going to talk about the Enneagram, a fascinating topic and a tool that we found to be very helpful and deeply meaningful over the past few years. And we were lucky enough to bring on one of the world's foremost proponents and teachers of the Enneagram, Morgan Cron. Ian is a best-selling author, psychotherapist, Enneagram teacher, Episcopal priest, and the host of the podcast Typology, which has over 20 million downloads. His books include the Enneagram Primer, The Road Back to You, which has sold over 1 million copies, and the book we base today's conversation on, The Story of You, an Enneagram journey to becoming your true self. For those unfamiliar with the Enneagram, at its most essential, it is a personality typing system identifying 9 types of people and how they relate to one another and the world. But it's intended to be much more than that, not just a typing system, but, in Ian's words, a prescription for deep change. In this conversation, Ian does an overview of the 9 basic Enneagram types, and you'll probably see yourself in at least one of them. But he also goes deeper. Ian says that we all have stories that we tell ourselves, and the Enneagram can help us see them, recognize when they're unhealthy, and start to rewrite them. As we continue on that path, Ian says, we'll begin to wake up, as the mystics have said, and find that everything is brimming with God's presence. We think that this is a really special episode, and we're so excited to share it with you. You can find all of Ian's books on Amazon and more about him at ianmorgancron.com. A huge thanks, of course, to Ian for coming on. And with that, we'll jump right in.
All right. Well, Ian, thank you so much for being here. It would really be difficult to overstate what a positive impact your work has had on our lives personally. So it really is an honor to have you. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So we discovered the Enneagram in 2016 with your book with Suzanne Stabile, The Road Back to You. And so I'd love to just start with why you decided to write a follow-up. And I'm so curious if you see this new book as an amendment to your original work on Enneagram, or if you feel like this is an additional resource. So I guess really what's so important about the stories that we tell ourselves?
Sure. So you're referring to this new book, The Story of You, which was a follow-up to The Road Back to You. And the answer to that question is yes, it's a both and, right? Like The Road Back to You is a primer, right? It's an introduction to the Enneagram. It helps people understand their type, the background of it, the relevance of it, the applicability of it, et cetera. And so really, it's actually the only primer out there that at least to date, that, helps people learn about what it is in a way that's entertaining and yet has some real depth. Now, the Story of You is a follow-up, but it can also be a standalone piece. The basic premise is that all of us have stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and how we think the world works, right? And our lives are wrapped in narrative. That's how we see the world. That's why we say things like, "Oh, I'm entering into a new chapter of my life," or that's on and on and on. There's just we understand who we are through story, and the problem is that we formulate lots of these stories as little children, and then we drag them into adulthood where they make a mess of our lives. I mean, they serve us in childhood and then begin to undermine us in adulthood. And so what I came to realize as I studied narrative therapy, I'm a therapist, and what I began to realize is that, oh, wow, these 9 Enneagram numbers are, yes, they're personality types, absolutely, but they're also stories that we tell ourselves, right? And those stories can be healthy and generative, or those stories can be really destructive. And we need to identify those stories in our lives that are self-defeating and painful and cause us problems, and those that could be helpful. And one of the greatest ways we can do that is by learning our Enneagram type and the story it tells us about who we are, and to let go of those parts of them that are lies.
Yeah, I absolutely love that in this book. And I want to talk so much, we want to talk so much more about that. But for listeners that are less familiar with the Enneagram, maybe could you talk a little bit about its background, maybe where it came from? And also there's this perception, I think, which may be true, I'm just curious your thoughts on this, that at least in relationship to other, personality types or tests, that it has a religious or even Christian element to it. So could you just give us a little bit of background on the Enneagram?
Yeah, sure. So the Enneagram is this ancient personality typing system that teaches there are 9 basic personality styles in the world, one of which we gravitate toward and adopt in childhood, just as a way to feel safe, to navigate the new world of relationships in which we find ourselves. And the cool thing about the Enneagram is it doesn't just tell us what we do, it tells us why we do it. Each type has an underlying unconscious motivation that drives the way that type habitually and predictably acts, thinks, and feels on a day-to-day basis. It is its roots are Christian. It is came to us from the early desert mothers and fathers. One monk in particular, Evagrius Ponticus. We see some of his early writings touching on it. But over all this time, between the advent of modern psychology and other source work, it has evolved into what it is today, which is quite different than what it was. Now it's a legitimate psychometric instrument. It's not what it was, 2000 years ago. I do love that you can approach the Enneagram through a spiritual lens if you choose. And yet tomorrow I'm working at Google, teaching people there the Enneagram so that they can develop better relationships and self-understanding and how they can better work with each other. So
are you really? That's awesome.
Yeah. So I'm not talking, in fact, most of my work, 99% of my work is in the corporate space. So I don't, it's something where I love that the Enneagram can be approached from a purely psychological point of view or a purely spiritual point of view or both. Tomorrow is psychological only. So anyway. Yeah.
And what would you say sets it apart from other personality typing systems? I mean, there were things that stood out to us. I've always been fascinated by personality tests and understanding more about who I am and who people are in my life. But what I loved about Enneagram is that it's always set up on the spectrum of health and unhealth. And it feels like there's a direction, that there's a way for your particular personality to be improving and to becoming the healthiest version of yourself, which is not going to look like the healthiest version of the person sitting next to you. And so that's what has been very exciting and expansive about this personality typing system. But I'm curious if there's something else that you see that really sets Enneagram apart.
Yeah, well said. So I've worked with or know about DISC, Strengths Finders, Colby, Hogan, Myers-Briggs. I mean, I can go on, and I love all of them. I like anything that helps people develop self-understanding, right? And self-awareness. Totally in favor. For me, the Enneagram is sort of the best system for doing that, in my opinion. One of the things that does differentiate it is, as you mentioned, Aubrey, is that the Enneagram recognizes that the human personality is dynamic. It changes. Who you are right now in this conversation with me is going to be very different than the person you're going to be when you go home tonight. Your personality is going to be different when you go to the grocery store later today or whatever. It's just our personalities are fluid, right? And they do move on a continuum from, let's call it, sometimes they call it healthy to unhealthy. Sometimes I would say from low awareness to high awareness, living in self-awareness to low self-awareness. I've heard lots of different words. So let's just say that, what we want to do is have a high level of self-awareness that where we are able to observe the stories that we are telling ourselves in real time and interrogate them. Like, is that story really true? Is that Enneagram 4 story really true right now? Like Aubrey, do you know what your type is?
Yes, I'm a helper.
Okay, so you're an Enneagram 2, the helper. Now, your unconscious motivation is a need to be needed. You want to meet the needs of others. And when you're unhealthy, you will use calculated strategic giving to actually win the appreciation of other people. It will look altruistic, but it's not when you're unhealthy. Now, when you're healthy, it does become altruistic, but you also start to practice self-care, and you're more in touch with your own feelings, not just with the feelings of others. I could go on and on and on here. When you tell yourself the story that I need to meet everyone's needs in order to be loved, well, that story helped you as a little kid kind of make sense of the world. But as an adult, if you keep living that codependent, crazy story, you're going to screw yourself and your relationships in a big way, right? And so what the Enneagram can help you do is go, oh, wait a minute. Oh, gosh, I'm back in that old story right now. And I'm doing crazy things. I'm saying yes to everybody. And I don't know how to have my own boundaries, blah, blah, blah. I got to get out of this story and go back to a healthy one. So I think that's an example of like the application of the story of you, this new book, right? It's like, oh, okay, this is the old story. Here's a better story.
Yeah, I love that. I like the idea of awareness versus unawareness, because it really does feel that simple in some cases. Like sometimes just being able to articulate what who you are and what your deadly sin is and what your virtue is, sometimes that's all you need to see the world more clearly. And I
Yes.
remember I had this epiphany right after the second book, I was thinking about Matthew and how I've always loved the Sermon on the Mount about giving your cloak also. And I realized for the first time, I love that story because that's really indulgent for me. Like, I like the idea that Jesus is giving me permission to just give and give and give some more. And like, that's actually, in my case, it feeds my deadly sin. And the story that's really uncomfortable for me is 4 chapters later about the woman with the issue of blood who grabs Jesus's cloak. And like, that's my story. Like, she was able to embody what she needed and be vulnerable and just take it. And like, I've never resonated with that story at all, but I feel like the Enneagram gave me awareness to understand that that's Jesus' message for me,
Yeah.
that giving is actually where I need to be careful and I need to have boundaries and practicing no. And no looks like growth for me, not giving the shirt off my back.
Yeah.
So I like that. That's less confusing than health and unhealth, just
yes.
awareness.
And I think the ultimate Enneagram story is the story of Martha and Mary. It's like, oh, guess what? Mary, stop serving people and then getting resentful when they don't help. That is classic Enneagram 2 behavior. Whereas, Martha really got it, right? It's like, was it Martha? Am I getting this backwards? Wait a minute.
We always wonder, right?
Totally.
Which was which?
Oh my gosh. I'm an Episcopal priest. You'd think I'd figure this out. Anyway, just laying at the feet of Jesus, right? And just receiving, versus this frantic running around, serving everybody, making the meal, and why isn't anyone helping me, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, guess what? That's unhealth. And this is the example of health, your sister.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's certainly a lot of stuff in the scriptures that would illuminate a lot of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. And Ian, it may be heresy to ask you to do this quickly, but could we run through the nine types and I'm so sorry, and their passions and virtues, just so that we have a little bit more foundation for the rest of the discussion? Would that be okay?
Sure, absolutely. Let's just make something that would probably be very, very helpful to lots of people, right? That each Enneagram type has a deadly sin, which is an emotional driver that holds and glues together all of that stuff, the unhealthy stuff that's going on inside the personality, right? We all are, susceptible to, every single one of those deadly sins. We practice each and every one of them. However, honestly, there is one that seems to get us into trouble more than, the other bunch, and there is what I call an antidotal virtue. So there's a virtue that cancels out or negates the deadly sin. And it is really shows you a growth path. This is where this type needs to go in order to achieve health, right? And, it's a small, among other things, this is one place they need to go. So we'll run through them super fast. I could write at least a 200-page book on each of these types. So I'm going to give you one or two sentences. God bless you. Here we go. Type 1s, they're called the improvers. They're ethical. They're meticulous. They're detail-oriented. They're morally heroic people. And they're motivated really by a need to be good, right? They just to be virtuous. And they need one of the ways they do that is by perfecting themselves, others in the world. That's a need they have. 2s, the helpers, warm, giving, supportive. They're motivated by a need to be needed. They really want to be liked and to avoid acknowledging their own needs, right? 3s, the performers, success-oriented, image-conscious, wired for productivity. They're motivated by a need to succeed, to appear successful, and to avoid failure. 4s, God bless them, the romantics. I include myself in this group. Creative, sensitive, moody. They're motivated by a need to be special and unique in order to compensate for a missing piece that they perceive is in their essential makeup that everybody else seems to have except for them, right? 5s are called the investigators. They're analytical. They're detached. Probably they are the most emotionally detached number on the Enneagram. They're very private and they're motivated by a need to gain lots and lots of knowledge in order to fend off feelings of inadequacy. and they want to, conserve lots of energy and really want to be very self-sufficient, avoid relying on others. 6s, the loyalists, committed, practical, funny, witty, down to earth. They are worst case scenario thinkers, and they're motivated by fear and the need for security and safety, support, and certitude. 7s, they're called the enthusiasts. They're fun, they're spontaneous, they're adventurous, they're motivated by a need to be happy, to plan stimulating experiences, and to avoid psychological and emotional pain. Then 8s, the challengers, controlling, intense, commanding, confrontational. They're motivated by a need to assert strength and power over the environment and others, to mask tender and vulnerable feelings. And then finally, the 9s, they're called the peacemakers, and they're pleasant, they're laid back, they're accommodating, and they're motivated really by a need to keep the peace internally and externally. And they really want to avoid conflict at all costs, because maintaining connection to them is what's so very, very important. I don't know. That was kind of a manic presentation.
That was amazing.
It's like but that's about as fast as I can. Yeah, once or twice.
That was really amazing. It makes me the first question that comes to mind when I hear you run through it like that is, where do these types come from? I imagine it's some combination of nature and nurture, of something inherent within us, as well as experiences that we have as we grow. What have you seen there?
So first of all, personality development is probably the most hotly contested debate in psychology, right? I mean, there's just so many points of view as to how we become the people that we are. For our purposes, and this is really for our purposes because it's far more complicated than this, but we could define personality as the way that we habitually show up for life. Let's just say that. It's just how we show up for life. It's the way that we act, think, and feel. We regularly act, think, and feel and we've done so over a long period of time, right? It's not something new. It's something that's been a consistent pattern in our life over a long period of time. So where does it come from? Is it genetics? Yes. Is it environment? Yes. Is it cultural? Yes. Is it, there's just so many forces. And I think there are so many forces that we have to approach it with a great deal of humility and just say, kind of shrug a little bit and say, I don't know. Yes, but I don't know what the percentages of influence are. I don't know if it's the same for everybody or it's different for people. Who knows? It's a fascinating idea to speculate about, but
yeah,
for the purposes of what we would use the Enneagram for, not particularly important.
I've heard you talk about how it's important for this to not become a parlor trick, but there's a temptation there to do that. When you're reading the book, of course, people are going to come to mind for you. So I'd love to hear you talk about just how Enneagram might be weaponized, but also like, how can it be useful in the context of people that outside of yourself?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, as is true with all things, right? Good things can be twisted and turned, used in ways that are really unhelpful. Here's the thing about the Enneagram. The Enneagram is uncannily accurate. When you read your type, you will feel like, oh my gosh, I have been exposed. This human being, whoever wrote this, has been reading my mail, and I feel uncomfortable, right? And you'll also feel consoled because it's like, oh my gosh, I am not crazy. There are other people like me out there. So it's wonderful, but uncannily accurate, which also means then that you could weaponize it and use it against people, which is not its intended purpose, right? Mm-hmm. One of the ways you could do that is by saying, oh, Aubrey, you're such a 2. You know what I mean? Like, that's dismissive. It's using it in a way that's insulting, actually. And I've seen people do it. It's like, oh my gosh, stop being such a 4. And it's like, you know what? That is actually not what this thing is about. We can use it to be, sometimes to be a little presumptuous. I could say, Tim, what's your type, by the way?
I'm either a 1 or a 5, and I cannot figure it out. Like, I spent so much time with it, and I would love to. All
right. So like, here's the thing. Like, you can imagine if I just say to you, Tim, you're a 5. And in other words, me typing you is like weaponizing the Enneagram as though I know you better than you know you. Yeah. And it's boxing you, and it's not giving you the freedom to go on the journey of self-discovery and having the joy of finding it yourself. Right. Yeah. I've seen that cause damage. I could give a lot of I do a whole thing on the Enneagram ethics, but it is something that we want to be careful that we use responsibly and ethically, because it is so accurate and so, you know, and the more accurate it is, of course, the more problems it will cause than it solves if you apply it inappropriately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And would you say that people ever apply it inappropriately to themselves? As I've gotten more into it, I've been struck by the phrase, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Yes.
You know, and so
yes.
it's like, I'm a one, like if somebody knew they were a one and they just, all they do is think about themselves in those one terms, they might be missing some nuance, because potentially there aren't 9 personality types. There are 7.5 billion personality types, you know, on Earth, because everybody is a little bit different. Have you seen that taken too far, over indexing on a particular type?
Yeah. I mean, yes, I have. The Enneagram will give people a low resolution picture of their inner architecture.
Mm.
Right. Now, I could go on with this and say that there are degrees of definition. If you start to go into the wings, which we don't have time to, or into subtypes, you're going to get higher and higher resolution pictures, right? But even if you got 10% more clarity about your partner's inner architecture or the person you work, that is a giant evolutionary step forward. It's giant. Right. But I say this because, you know, look, this thing isn't magic. It wasn't found in a cave in Syria by Harrison Ford, you know, like on magic tablets. I mean, it's just, you know, it is what it is. It's very, very helpful, but it ain't perfect. It's a useful tool. Now, but sometimes people take it a little too far and they overly identify with their type. They sometimes will use their type as an excuse for bad behavior. You know, if you are an Enneagram 1, let's say, the improver, and you start trying to go on overdrive, perfecting yourself, others in the world, and when people don't conform to your standards, you start to judge and criticize them in a way that they really don't appreciate, you know, well, that's a poor use of understanding your type, right? It's like,
Yeah.
you
Or to
shouldn't
justify
say,
my behavior potentially by saying, well, I'm a 1. That's how ones
exactly,
operate, you know?
exactly. That's not what the Enneagram is for,
Yeah.
right? Now, as to your point about there being billions and billions of personality types, yes and no. So let's just think about the color spectrum, right? We know, you know, what I would say is that when you go to buy red at Home Depot, like to paint your living room, you suddenly will discover when you get there that there are an infinite number of shades of red. Right. There's just no such thing as, no, there's cranberry and there's rose and there's, you know what I mean? There's all kinds of reds out there, but they're all red. Right.
Yeah.
Now, in the same way, I'm an Enneagram 4. Let's make that the equivalent of green. Now, yes, am my own little individual expression of the 4. However, I'm still green. So it explains why, you know, I look like a lot like a certain subset of the population while maintaining my individuality.
Yeah.
What I will say is that I believe that there are 9 sort of unconscious motivations that drive people. And I do believe that they appear consistently culturally across the human spectrum. That's the Enneagram is taught for thousands of years, and I ascribe to it.
That makes sense. Can we talk about a Jerry Contra and maybe just move into this idea of what growth can actually look like inside your own number?
Sure. So, you know, let's go back to passions and, deadly sins and the virtue, right? So let's take me. I'm a 4. I'm a romantic. Because I believe that I am missing something critical in my inner makeup. I don't know what it is. It's kind of unnameable and unattainable. It's like C.S. Lewis says, Sehnsucht. It's this inconsolable longing for the unnameable. And it's like, oh God, there's something missing in me. Now, some great things can come out of that, like songwriters and books and different stuff, right? Very 4s are disproportionately represented in the creative arts. So you can see why. But it makes sense then that you would see that my deadly sin is envy, right? Because I'm always envying what I perceive everybody else has, which is happiness and normalcy and wholeness. And so the virtue I have to work on, because that creates in me a lot of emotional thunderstorms, I have to work on, the Enneagram teaches me, equanimity. So I have to work on having emotional balance in the face of whatever life throws at me at any given moment. You know, Aubrey, yours is actually pride, which is hard for 2s, usually the helpers to get their hands around. reveals itself in the fact that you think you actually know everybody else's needs better than they do. And you might actually go and try to meet those needs without their consent, which is also a kind of pride. And I could go on with that. What you have to work on then is humility, which is the knowledge that you don't have all the time, treasure, talents, and energy in the world to meet the needs of every single person you meet. So these are guideposts, right? These are journeys of healing that the Enneagram gives us. Now, how do you get there with a Jerry Contra? So let's go back to Loyola, Ignatius of Loyola, who we know, the great Catholic saint that many people know through the Ignatian exercises. Loyola would say that one of the things we should do is practice to actually go against the grain of who we perceive we are, and to begin doing the opposite of those things that we have habitually done in order to achieve a higher expression of ourselves. So as I mentioned, for you, it's like, I got to get some self-awareness when my arrogance and my pride takes over, and begin to do the opposite of what I've always done. And Tim, if you're a 1, the improver, you have to begin to say, all right, well, my deadly sin really is anger. And it comes out in the form of resentment that other people are not as concerned as I am about perfecting myself, others, in the world. I have to move towards serenity, which is my virtue, which is, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't perfect or I can't change. Courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Just to be at peace with the fact that you have no one pinned a badge on you saying, go perfect the world. And it's not even possible. So give it up and, stop beating yourself up and other people when you're not very healthy for not being, what you think everyone should be.
Yeah.
These are wonderful journeys of healing. They're also really hard. And we practice at Jerry Contra to get to that virtue.
Yeah.
I love it because it's so simple, but it's not simple until you know what your virtue is, right? Like, like for me in a situation where I feel tempted to overgive, like to do the, give without permission, like you were saying, for a 5, their virtue may be that they choose to give in that situation. And so I think, I would get lost in self-help books, and I think I could easily go down this path of something that was actually less healthy for me, because it was just not, it was for somebody else. It was for somebody who needed to practice non-attachment. And what I needed to practice was having a solid self with boundaries that can occasionally say no or not so much, So
Right.
it was so helpful to just have one single word that, I know when I have a decision that I'm going to always try to reach for the humility, which often looks like vulnerability. And that might not be the case for Tim or anybody else, but it's useful to remember that I'm always going to have this pull toward the pride of not having any needs. So this is maybe the most powerful idea in the book. And I loved how simple it got in this second book.
Yeah, I'm so glad.
And do you want to, go ahead, Tim.
Oh, well, I was going to ask, do you believe, Ian, that it's possible for someone's type to change over time? And I will give you a little bit of background on that question. And it gets sort of to my quandary about whether I'm a 1 or a 5. When I was a younger person, I was very as dedicated as one could be to rule following. Wanted to be as perfect as possible. It even got into sort of like scrupulosity and like that kind of really unhealthy tendencies. And I also felt like I had the weight of the world on my shoulders. I literally felt like it was my responsibility to save the world, or at least my corner of it, And now, so I feel like that's changed a lot, partially intentionally, because that sort of broke for me. And even now when I take an Enneagram test, I test with a lot of 1, but a little bit more 5. But it's like when I'm answering the questions, I'm almost intentionally moving away from the 1. I see that as I'm like, oh, well, I used to feel that way, but now I'm going to answer this differently. And then I come out as a 5, so is that an indicator that you really can change a type, or have I been moving along the spectrum of health in some way, or what do you see there?
So great question. First, and this is sometimes comes as a revelation to people, but it's super important. You are 9 types, Tim. You have all 9 types in you. It's just that 1 is dominant. 1 sounds and is more like you than the other 8. So you have 5 in you. You have 6, 7, 8, to differing degrees, right? When you look at the Enneagram diagram, you'll see that it's very dynamic. It's flying all over the place. So numbers are in conversation with each other all the time. Now, as regards, who you are today versus who you are as a kid, pay attention to who you were as a kid, because, the thing is your Enneagram type will never change according to traditional teaching. You can evolve, but not change. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you could have a very big crash as an Enneagram 1, and where you end up breaking your own heart because of the way that you are moving through the world. You're just breaking your own heart, and you wake up, you have an awakening, which, is, this should not be surprising. It's interesting in the Christian tradition. I'm always telling people it's an enlightenment religion, and they look at me like, that's very Eastern. And, people who are very conservative get very uptight. And I'm like, well, we talk about wanting to be filled with the light all the time. So why are we worried about calling this an enlightenment religion, right? Like it is the point, right? Is to be enlightened with the light of Christ. Now, I think what, people have experiences where they crash and they have enlightenment, right? It's like, well, they break apart, and then suddenly there's, like Leonard Cohen said, there's a way for the light, not only to get out, but to get in, right? Wow. So it seems to me that you can evolve and you can see other parts of your personality come to the fore. But if you as a young person really exhibited the patterns of a 1, I would be inclined, and I don't know you, so I don't want to presume too much, but for the purpose of the conversation, I would say, when you're a little person or you're a teenager or something like that, it's like you are so floored in your personality because you lack any self-awareness. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like very few kids have a lot of self-awareness. And it just may be that you've done enough work that you have moved beyond the more glaring problems of the 1. However, let me ask you a question. Do you have a very powerful inner critic?
Absolutely.
Okay. And that continues in you to today?
Yes. Very powerful. Yes.
Okay. That inner critic is sort of one, not the only one, but one of the litmus tests that I give to people. Because it can be a brutal inner prosecutor that we tend, until it's challenged, to think it's the voice of God. Like the Holy Spirit is going, you should do this. You ought to do this. You must do that. And it's like, it just beats the bejesus out of you. Do you guys know who, go ahead, Tim.
You're speaking my language. Like this was, so you may know that Latter-day Saints have this custom where many young people will go on a mission for 2 years when they're 19, 18, 19. And man, that inner voice, that inner critic, the inner scrupulous critic, to me, that was God speaking to me the whole time. And so that's making so much sense.
Yeah, it's a great relief when Enneagram 1s find out, maybe not.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe not. Maybe it's just my superego on overdrive, which is kind of what it is. If we were going to talk about it through the lens of Freud's, psychoanalytical view of the world. However, let me just say this. When an Enneagram 1, and by the way, Enneagram 2s as well, I could apply this to all 9 types. When they collide with a more conservative religious worldview, it can create havoc, particularly for Enneagram 1s who are really needing to be good and to do the right thing, who want to follow the rules of the Bible, who want to do what the church tells them to do, all of which I'm not saying those are bad things, but you collide those with somebody who wants to perfect themselves in the world. And what you're doing is throwing a log on a very self-destructive fire. Now, same with you, Aubrey. I mean, how many women in the church are told that their only job is to meet the needs? Go make the dang coffee, Aubrey, because that is going to feed into your Enneagram 2 helper stuff. And it actually is going to throw a log on that fire. And all of a sudden you realize I'm in the wrong story. Like I have been told a story by my religious tradition that actually has connected with my personality and has put it into a degree of intensity that now, it's going to make you crash eventually, and so, and I could apply that to all the types, how they relate to particular religious systems, but, it will, when you kind of wake up and go, oh, wait a minute, I can be a good Mormon without being a perfectionist. Or I could be a good Mormon without, making the coffee or running around delivering casseroles to the planet. I don't really have to do that. And I mean, I realize those are stereotypical. I hope it's not insulting, but you get the
No,
idea.
you are spot on. It's scary.
It's,
But
it's uncanny.
I want not the coffee part, not the hot
Yeah,
chocolate
that-
and the casserole.
yeah.
But I wanted to ask you about
Oh,
that.
that's right. The coffee part
That's
doesn't
right.
fly. Decaf. What the heck?
Yeah, exactly.
But we were wondering that we were talking about, like, do very conservative or just maybe hyper religious communities tend to create specific numbers, because it seems like a 1 and a 2 and a 3, like those are all great fits for our religious community. And so I'm curious if you see more of that. And I don't know if I don't know which one creates which, if the 1s, 2s, and 3s just find themselves in more religious communities, or if you see any connection there. But we were curious about that. And peacemakers too. Like there are some of these numbers that feel like it would be really easy to find yourself in the Bible and feel like you're right on track, and this is the way everybody is meant to be.
Okay, so that's the wrong, that actually needs to be challenged. So one of the things I tell corporate leaders all the time is, and this is true for anybody, that one of the greatest mistakes we can make in life is to presume that our way of seeing the world is normal.
Mm.
Because the moment you believe that your way of seeing the world is normal, then you will feel justified in judging and actually dismissing or being unkind to people who see, you will judge other people as seeing the world abnormally.
Yes.
Right. And that's, if the Enneagram is right, there are 9 normals. Right. So I would say that, one of the things we oftentimes say with the Enneagram is that it kind of represents the face of God, because all of these 9 types represent really the nature of the character of God, right? So Enneagram 1s would be how would I say this? Would be the goodness of God. And 2s, the love of God. 3s, the glory of God. 4s, the pathos and suffering of God. 5s would be the wisdom of God. 6s, the unfailing loyalty of God. 7s, the joy of God. 8, the wrath and justice of God. Not wrath, power and justice of God. And 9, the peace of God. Now, so each of us has a particular affinity for this characteristic of God's nature. Of course, we contain all 9, as I mentioned earlier, which makes sense if we're made in the image of God. There's just one particular facet of it that we really kind of resonate with. All to say that, I think all types could be represented in all religious traditions, right? They have to be, right? They just have to be. There's no way around it. Now, a 4 may feel very strange in a Reformed tradition, because maybe they feel like the Reformed tradition in its most conservative expression might be a little too tight and rigid, whereas a 1 might find that attractive. Right. Whereas a 2, I'll just say, like, or maybe a 7 would be drawn to a more charismatic deal, and a 5 could be very drawn to Eastern Orthodoxy. But I think these are sort of, I don't know. It's just too simplistic to sit around thinking that there's types are all, this type is a trillion, this and that, and the next thing. Everybody's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah. I've heard you say, I've heard you say that, I think I've heard you say that Jesus didn't have a number, and maybe this is what you're talking about. The face of God contains all 9 numbers, but so talk about what is the difference? Like, is that our goal to kind of move toward the center? And is there a difference between redeeming our stories and erasing our stories altogether?
Yeah. Well, good luck with that.
Okay.
The stories we tell ourselves, they came to us when we were very little, and it's very hard for us to, we don't have enough time on this earth to lather, rinse, and repeat those stories to get rid of them altogether. There's just not enough time. What you can do is just recognize when those stories have taken the wheel again, and just loosen your grip and say, that used to make sense, but it doesn't anymore. And I don't have to live being tyrannized by the message of those stories any longer, right? I don't need to perfect myself, others in the world. I don't need to meet the needs of all these people. I don't have a missing piece. You know what I mean? It's like, just get rid of the old story and start to embrace a new one. To your point, I do think Jesus doesn't have a type. I think Jesus is all 9 types in the most perfect of ways, and he can draw on the energies and the gifts of all those 9 types as needed, right? So he can be an 8 challenger in one situation and be a 2 helper in another, and, an improver, reformer in another, on and on and on. I do think that one of the interesting ways, it's not the only way, but an interesting way of thinking about spiritual formation is that the journey to Christ-likeness, if you will, is one from letting go of just the confines of just having one type and moving toward the middle, that white field at the center of the Enneagram where there is no type, right? And I think certain people in history have done pretty well with that, whether it's St. Francis of Assisi or others, they seem to have moved further along on the journey toward the center where Jesus is. But, it's as the journey is long and hard, and we all die unfinished symphonies, as Karl Rahner once said. And I think, that's what we have to be at peace with.
Yeah. Could we talk a little bit more about this concept of story and the stories we tell ourselves and how we might rewrite our stories, and maybe even some examples would be helpful, because if I were listening to this, and this is what I'm thinking right now, I'm trying to come up with what are my stories? How do I mine those? How do I get at those? And how do I start down the path of rewriting them?
Yeah, well, I think the Enneagram will actually start to tell you at least one of the very, if not the dominant story you've been telling yourself. So Tim, for you, it is that we live in this imperfect world where it's rife with error, and you feel as though in your story that you're responsible. You have been given a divine mission of correcting those imperfections, righting those wrongs, fixing those mistakes, not only in yourself, but in the world around you. Right. Yeah. And now that story probably got you a lot of strokes as a little kid, particularly growing up in a religious tradition.
Absolutely.
And so you just kept hearing, if I do that, I'm going to get a lot of love. I'm going to get a lot of respect. I'm going to really feel like I belong if I do that. And I'm going to be accepted in the group in a way that I deeply long to be accepted. I want to be good. I want to be virtuous. And now that's all fine and good until you take that story too far and you drag it into adulthood. And suddenly you're still running around trying to perfect yourself, others in the world on overdrive. Now, that will cause you a lot of internal pain. This is true. You have beaten yourself up for years and years and years for not living up to the most ridiculous high internal standards. And every time you actually achieve those internal standards, you raise the bar. Right? Yep. And so, this is a painful way to be in the world. Not only that, but when you are not in a very good space, you demand that other people live up to your high internal standards because you believe that there's only two ways to do things, your way and the wrong way. And so when people don't actually live up to those standards, you might feel justified to critique them, criticize them, or judge them. And even if you don't do it verbally, they will pick it up coming off you like secondhand smoke. They will just feel that in your presence that they're inadequate. Again, it probably helps you make sense of the world as a little person and maybe even got you some strokes, but it's going to screw you up as an adult. That's a bad story. That story has to go.
Yeah.
Now, it ain't easy, but it's got to go. Yeah. And sounds like you've already experienced a crash as a result of some of that stuff happening in your life. Is that fair?
That's totally fair. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. In mid to late 20s, the scrupulosity, clinically diagnosable at this point, OCD, it totally crashed, broke everything open.
Yes. Thank God, right? We in the religious Eastern Orthodoxy, we talk about the bright abyss. And you seem to have fallen into it, right? It feels like an abyss when you have to let go of that story, but it's bright. It's a wonderful abyss. It's this paradox, which is sometimes hard for ones to get their hands on because they tend to be a little black and white in their thinking, right? But fours do really well with paradox. We actually think it's yummy. So anyway, that story's got to go, and you need to go into a couple of patterns. One is I would say to you, number one, I want you to see the old story, and I want you to be able to articulate what that old story was, and right. Then I want you to own it. Right. Which is to say, I want you to own, what does this story cost me and others? That is not an uncomfortable. So part of the journey here is not very comfortable. Right. And, but I would say to him, like, let's own what's happened here. Right. And then awaken. I want you to be able to say, I want to wake up to when this story has taken hold of my life again, and learn some ways to release my arthritic grip on it, and then finally to sit down and actually begin to write a new story that feels more in alignment with your values and who you are. I just recently read a book by Miroslav Volf that I really like. He's a theologian at Yale. You may know him, but anyway, he wrote a book called What Matters Most. And in it, he asked some questions I think would be so helpful on the journey of rewriting a story. Like, for example, is the life I want worth wanting? Is the life I'm living worth living? Or is it, and then you sit down and you realize, oh my gosh, the life I want is to join a country club, live in a gated community, retire at 53 and die on the golf course. Is that a life worth wanting? Right? And then these are the kinds of things you start to ask yourself in the rewrite process. It's like, what is the life I want? Is it worth wanting? What is the life I want? Is the life of a 1 as I've lived it, or is it 2? How have those worked for me? Oh, they haven't. Well, then what do you want to do? So these are the processes that you go through, and I talk about them in the book. And in the workbook, I sort of help people work through what a rewrite looks like.
Yeah, that's so powerful. Are there stories that don't sour in adulthood? Like, are there children who grow up with stories that don't break as they become adults? Or is this just the process of development?
Well, I think there are messages that we pick up as children that are healthy and helpful to us, like I'm lovable. That's a great story, right? That's a great message to pick up. But I will say, if we really believe that the world is broken, which I do, it is inevitable that we come into the world with lines of broken code, right? We have stories that are corrupt. I don't mean like corrupt in the moral sense, but they're broken. Yeah, we have broken stories. And so it is really important for us to examine them. No one has a completely charmed story. Nobody. There's just no way. Your parents can't protect you from the stories that you will take on. Some of them are intergenerational. Some of them have to do with past generational trauma. You can't stop that. It's just, we carry it. We carry the unlived lives of our parents. We end up, living their stories. We are handed stories by the culture. I am a woman, therefore I must be X. Who gave you that story? You didn't sign up for that story. You know what I mean? So we have to go into the stories and we have to ask ourselves, what can stay? What has to go?
I'm curious if you feel like we need each other. Like, does each number on the Enneagram need the other 8 for their own growth? Like, is it, I guess, and maybe I'm asking this, as a Latter-day Saint, like, I feel like maybe the places where you see your most unconscious moments are going to be at church, in community, with rubbing up against other people who may be unconscious, and it can be so painful, but it also feels like in a lot of ways, that's the kind of tension that wakes you up. So have you seen that? Do you feel like we need each other, or can you do this on your own?
The foot cannot tell the eye that it doesn't need it, or whatever it is. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, it's like, no, you need every single type. You can't say to yourself, there's some certain types I just don't need. You need all 9 types to grow as a person, and the community needs all 9 types to function well. So because if they all represent a different nature of the character of God, some facet of it, well, do we want to leave any of those out? I think not. So we need it communally, and we need it as individuals.
Yeah. A few minutes ago, you used the phrase "waking up" as it pertains to sort of rewriting one story. I've heard Richard Rohr use that phrase a lot. It's in a lot of traditions. Why do you think that this sort of metaphor of asleep and awake is useful for as it pertains to development and growing into greater levels of health?
Sure. All right. So this is a big idea. All right. So if you were to take all of the teachings, particularly of the contemplatives and the mystics, right? And I don't know how that works in the Mormon tradition, if they're valued or not. But, I am talking about Ignatius of Loyola and Julian of Norwich, and, Richard Rohr would be put in that category. Thomas Merton would be another one in our contemporary context. If you were to boil down, and by the way, I would also say, dare I say, that when you get into the more mystical sections of Islam or Buddhism, or, it's the same thing. If you were to boil down all their teachings to one phrase, it would be wake up. That's what it all comes down to across the traditions. I think Jesus would say the same thing. Wake up. You are asleep. you are asleep to who you are, you're asleep to the kingdom that lives within you. And that's why you can go around the world doing all kinds of batty stuff that is damaging to others, right? So I do think that we go through the world in a sort of an unconscious or semi-conscious spiritual state, unaware, living without any awareness of who we are and who we could be and who God is. And so everything is about waking up to the fact that if you just nick the surface of anything in life, you're going to find the face of God. That is this awakening. That is that moment of going, oh my gosh, everything is brimming with presence. Everything. And to live in a state of that kind of awareness is to live as a saint. To go through the world and to see, I think it was Julian and Nora, she had this great quote. She says, it is the madness of great love to see God in all things. Right? And so I think that to me is when you wake up, that's what you see. It is the madness of great love to see God in all things. Enneagram can help on that journey, and also just the classic spiritual disciplines. I mean, the Enneagram is not the only tool. I mean, I'm not going to ever tell somebody I want you to give up science. I mean, solitude and silence and so many of the other disciplines, So,
but what do you say to someone who says, religion is about turning outward, and this is the opposite. This is like so self-focused, and this is the kind of indulgence that this newer generation is really into it. It's all about you or it's all about me and who I am and having an identity and being authentic. How I feel like in some ways, I mean, you could read Enneagram and recognize like, yeah, there's a call for real introspection here, but how is that different than the self-indulgence of selfishness and expecting the world to sort of cater to who you are?
Sure. Well, I mean, look, the Enneagram could be used that way. I mean, I said it earlier, but you could take any instrument and twist it into something that it's not meant to be, right? I will say this, and this might be a little, well, I'll say it. One of the greatest addictions, sick addictions in our culture, and actually I've been working a lot with addictions, is people have an addiction to religion. And the problem with having an addiction to religion is, the way that expresses itself is in using religion as a tool for avoiding self-discovery by being completely outside focused. It's like, I don't want to look inside. So and in fact, let's make it a virtue to just focus on Jesus. Let's just make that a virtue. And let's just say we need to focus everything on serving the outside world. And in fact, let's do stuff like crusades. Okay, that's great. Wow. Let's just turn our outward focus into something that's violent. You know what I mean? Or has violent language associated with it. So it seems to me that Christianity can be, or in any of its expressions, can be too outwardly focused to the exclusion of self-discovery. And the mystics and the contemplatives were much better at the inward focus. So what is the ideal? It is to live in this beautiful tension between, and Rohr would say this and others, it was not original to him, between action and contemplation. And if you spend all your time in action, right, social action, justice, looking at the world, doing, all that outward focus stuff, and don't pay attention to contemplation, what will end up happening is you could become a judgmental, righteous, and bitter activist who is, only blah, blah, blah. And if you're overly focused on contemplation, if that's your temperament and tendency, that's me, then what you run the danger of is becoming pious and disconnected from the pain of the world. So what we want to do is get both of those into this creative tension so that one corrects the excesses of the other. So when I'm too action focused, I need to start looking more at contemplation. And when I'm too contemplative and disconnected from the world, I need to go back out and serve the poor. So, it's like, okay, let's get these two things into balance, because neither one is wrong. It's just they're wrong if one is being used exclusively over the other. And there are so many Christians who want to say, no self-discovery for me. Oh, no, because they don't want to look at their stuff. That's what's happening. It's called resistance in psychology. And it's like, you need it, man. You need both. That's really important.
Wow.
That's so good, Ian. Just as we wrap up here, for anybody that's listening to this and hasn't heard of the Enneagram or is intrigued, or maybe has just heard about it tangentially, but it wants to maybe start on a journey using the Enneagram as a tool, where would you recommend they begin? Obviously,
Okay.
other than buying The Road Back to You and The
Both
Story of You, but both books, and diving into those.
Well, let me just say, at the risk of being overly self-marketing, the reason that the Road Back to You is such a good book is because it's an introduction. Many books on the Enneagram I love, as a clinician particularly, but lots of them are 500 pages and very dry and clinical. Content rich, love them to death. Most people can't quit their day job and read those books. So the Road Back to You is just a simple way in, and you get a lot out of it, enough that if you chose not to read another book, you'd still get some stuff to use. Fantastic, right? Or you could go down the wormhole and really get some stuff to use, right? So, so both those books for sure. People could go to my website, Ian Cron, IANCRON.com. They could take an IEQ-9 Enneagram assessment, which would help them on the journey toward finding out their type. There are courses there. There's all kinds of stuff from business to personal development stuff. And of course, there's tons of other books out there on the Enneagram. I cannot, actually, some of them are kind of kooky, so you have to be kind of discerning. But yeah, I would just start, particularly if you hail from a faith tradition. I think the Road Back to You is actually really the best place to start.
I think so. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, this has been amazing. We're so grateful for your work and for the interview. This is awesome.
It's been really, really special, Ian. Thank you.
Oh man, what a joy. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, thanks so much for listening. And a huge thanks to Ian for coming on. Again, you can find The Story of You and Ian's other books on Amazon, and you can find out more about Ian's work at ianmorgancron.com. And as always, if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get a chance, we'd love for you to leave a review or rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you listen on. It really helps get the word out about Faith Matters, and we really appreciate the support. Thanks again for listening, and as always, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.